Welcome, everybody, to On This Day on the Grueling Truth Sports Network. And today we're going to talk about February the 27th, 1960, the forgotten miracle where the United States Olympic hockey team beat the supposedly invincible Russians. And it sounds like we've done this show recently, and we have. And when Al Michaels uttered those six famous words, "Do you believe in miracles?" Yes, after the U.S. men's hockey team upset the Soviet Union en route to winning the 1980 Olympic Games, the prominent TV announcer could have easily been describing another Team USA squad. It was 60 years before the official Miracle on Ice when U.S. men's hockey team stunned the world by capturing gold in the 1960 Olympics. As soon as the U.S. knocked off the Russians in the semifinals of the 80 Olympics and went on to beat Finland for the gold, the 60 team became overshadowed. But the 60 team won the country's first gold in the sport, and in an improbable fashion. Coach Jack Riley led 17 amateur players to stardom in Squaw Valley, California. The 60 squad is still the only U.S. men's hockey group to go through the Olympics without a loss or a tie. If you remember, the 1980 team had the opening game tie against Sweden of 2-2. Now, nearly 60 years later, the 60 team has lost the notoriety it greatly deserves. And winger Bill Cleary in an interview said that Jackie Riley used to get really upset at that. But it never bothered me. He said, I said, hey, we know that we did it. I'll tell you, I do hear from a lot of people, not so much from our own team, but here's a lot of people saying, wait a minute, you guys were the first miracle, not the 80 team. Now, nobody gave them a chance. In fact, they were just as big an underdog, if not more, because if you remember at the time, Canada and Czechoslovakia were both powerhouses in Olympic hockey, and the U.S. wasn't expected to get by any of these teams. And, there was a lot of similarities between the 60 and 80 squads. U.S. goalie Jack McCartan had this to say about it. He said the Russian team that they played in 80 was a much better Russian team than we played, McCartan said. The one we played had won the previous Olympics in 1956, so they were good. But they weren't anything like the 80 Russian team. But then you look at the 80 team, didn't have to play the Canadians, and the Canadians were just as big a hurdle in 1960 as the Russians. Overshadowed or not, the 1960 Olympic team is certainly a bunch of guys who have earned the right to be household names. Players such as Bill and Bob Cleary, McCartan, John Mayasich, Jack Carane, Roger and Bill Christian, they were the glue that held the team together and brought home Olympic gold. The Soviet Union and Canada came into the 1960 Olympics as the favorites. The U.S. wasn't even in the conversation despite taking silver in 1956. Not many people gave us much of a chance, said Bill Cleary. I remember all the press. I think they were picking us to finish 12th, and there were only 9 teams in the finals. That's what they thought of us. But now, this team really enjoyed being underdogs. The Americans flew under the radar, even playing in their home country. McCartan believes it was to the USA's advantage to be overlooked in the tournament. He went on to say, maybe they weren't taking us as seriously as some of the other teams. But like I say, if you look at our roster and you look at the two Clearys and Bob McVeigh on one line, they're all top-notch hockey players. And then we had the two Christians and Tommy Williams, and they were great hockey players. That whole line, and you had Weldy Olson, Paulie Johnson. Paulie was one of the premier hockey players in Minnesota for his age at the time, and one of the best offensively, if not defensively. Also, Meredith, Rodenheiser, Grazia, they were all good players, and that defense was good. Now, Olsen remembers that the team was actually picked fifth entering the tournament. Now, when people think of the 60 team, and so many articles said that a bunch of carpenters and insurance men and so on got together and played, said Olsen, we actually had over 30 years of international experience between the guys. Now, Olsen said that there were only 2 guys at the pre-Olympic training camp who hadn't played internationally. It was a group of players who knew how to compete at a high level on the biggest stage. The guys took a positive outlook into the 10-day tournament, and they were determined to do well. So, when Team USA started to take form in 1959 for the following Olympic Games, national team members and camp invitees held practice at the University of Minnesota. Riley, who coached at Army at the time, paired his list of 25 players he was going to take with him to West Point. Olson recalls Riley telling the players he would post a sheet with the names of the guys who made the cut. What Riley meant to say was that he was posting a list of the players he was cutting. When the list was out, there was a great deal of confusion. Jack McCartan looked at the list and said, "Boy, they cut some really good guys," Olson said. McCartan's name was on the list. He wasn't invited to West Point. Years later, Riley told Olson that McCartan was cut because of some bad outings by the goalie during international competition in 1959. But when the goalies who made the cut got to West Point, they weren't impressive between the pipes. "We could score all the time on these guys," Olson said, so Jack, Riley, was asked, "What the hell are you going to do?" And they said, "Get McCartan back." And that's exactly what Riley did. He brought back McCartan to compete with Larry Palmer, who was Riley's goalie at West Point. Now, Team USA spent a few months prior to the Olympics playing exhibition games against international teams. Riley had set a 17-man roster. But just a few weeks before heading to Squaw Valley, the coach made a few roster adjustments. He added brothers Bill and Bob McCleary and Masage, a smooth offensive defenseman. And you had Herb Brooks, who would later coach the 1980 Olympic team to gold, was actually the final cut from the team. Dropping and adding 3 players so close to the games wasn't the ideal situation for Team USA. It ruffled some feathers in the locker room, that's for sure. Now, McCartan went on to say, some of the guys were upset. They weren't there for the whole deal, and they just came when we were in Denver. I guess right before we went to L.A. They were a little upset, but that didn't last, maybe a day. The Americans played a few exhibition games in L.A. against Czechoslovakia before making the 500-mile trip up the coast to Squaw Valley. Like the 1980 team, the 60 squad got to compete on its homeland. Crowds for the hockey games were certainly in the USA's favor. The rink out there held, 8,500 people, but they had something like 10,000 people for some of our games, McCartan said. They were stacked all over. You couldn't get a ticket, and it was a big ticket out there. They helped a lot. When you're going good and you have the crowd behind you, that's a huge plus. Now, the U.S. was placed in the Group C in the 9-team Olympic field. In the preliminary rounds, the Americans upset the favored Czechoslovakians 7-5 before trampling Australia 12-1. That advanced the U.S. into the medal round. Back in 1960, the tournament was a round-robin style, so there wasn't a true gold medal game. I think once we won the first 2 games, we gained confidence and we just felt we could beat anyone, Cleary said. I think we were all saying to ourselves, we've come this far, we've got to win it. Team USA dispatched of Sweden 6-3 and Germany 9-1 to set up a showdown with fellow unbeaten and gold medal favorite Canada on February the 25th, 1960. Bob Cleary scored in the opening period to give the U.S. the lead. In the second period, Johnson intercepted a Canadian pass, was all alone crossing into the opponent's zone. McCartan said he got over the blue line and shot and beat the Canadians' goalie. I said, "Well, what the hell did you do that for, Polly?" He said, "Well, I thought I had him beat." I said, "Oh, Jesus, he was that kind of player, you know." Olson was on the ice for the shift with Johnson and also questioned his teammate. I said, "What the hell were you doing, Polly? You could have went in." Olson said, "Hell, I had him beat. That's Polly. Polly wanted to get off the ice, so he let it go." A 2-0 lead after 2 periods was ample for the Americans as McCartan registered 38 saves, allowing just a third-period goal and a 2-1 victory. The Canadians were real rivals of us, McCartan said. Over the years we played, I don't think we ever beat them, tied them maybe once, I don't know. That was the most pleasurable game I've ever played. If we didn't beat Canada, I'm not sure we would have beat the Soviet Union, Olson said. Cleary remembers hearing TV announcers Bud Palmer say the U.S.-Canada game was the most watched sporting event to date in the history of television. 2 nights after the victory over Canada, Team USA took on the reigning Olympic champions, the Soviet Union. The Russians were coming off their first Olympic gold in 1956 and were also unbeaten in the tournament. The Soviet Union was essentially a bunch of professional players, part of the Red Army. The Americans trailed 2-1 after a rocky first period. McCartan said they had different rules than us, but if you had a 2-minute penalty and they scored, the guy didn't come out of the box. I think we were short-handed there, 2 men for a period of time in the first period. We were fortunately getting out of the first period only down by a goal. It could have been a lot more. We had a lot of penalties. Then another thing, if you had a penalty and you iced the puck, then they would bring it back like it was regular icing. That made it a little bit different also. Now, just like the 80 team, the U.S. had to come from behind to down the Russians. The Christians brothers took over in the final 2 periods as Roger fed Bill to tie the game in the second, and the combo connected again in the third as the Americans won 3-2. It was a pleasure beating them, to be honest about it, McCartan said. There wasn't much time for U.S. players to celebrate the victory since they had an 8 a.m. game the next morning against Czechoslovakia. I think the tournament organizers thought the Canadians and Russian game, which was the last game, would be the key game, Cleary said, but we kind of spoiled the fun. The U.S., which had already beaten the Czechs in the opening round, needed a little time on the ice to wake up that Sunday morning, trailing 4-3 after 2 periods. Then the floodgates opened as the Americans scored 6 third-period goals, led by Roger Christian's 3 goals to pull off a 9-4 win. It was a great moment, Cleary said. I don't think it hit us until sometime after that because we were just going on adrenaline. McCartan said the on-ice celebration after the game was one of the best parts of the tournament. The guys tried to continue celebrating off the ice as well. We were in Saginaw Valley, and there was nothing around there. It's a resort, McCartan said. There wasn't much you could do. We had a few beers. I don't know where we got them. We just kind of sat around and drank beer. I think Masage went back the same night. He was at work by Monday morning. Then everybody the next morning, Monday morning, were going their separate ways. We didn't have a heck of a lot of time to celebrate. Winning the gold is still one of the biggest thrills of McCartan's life, who helped the University of Minnesota baseball team win the national title in 1956. It was special for the players to be the first U.S. hockey team to capture gold. So, we had 1980, but we also had 1960. And 1960 was just as special, and to me, 1980 may have been bigger. Circumstances were a little bit different. The game was played in color instead of black and white. But 1960 was a huge deal. And I remember when the U.S. was making the run in 1980, where Al Michaels, Ken Dryden would go back and reference the 1960 team often during that tournament. And the 1960 Olympic hockey team should not be forgotten because what they did was one of the most magical moments in sports history, especially in the United States. So on this day, February the 27th, 1960, the United States, in the forgotten miracle, upset the Soviet Union. Remember, guys, you can hear us on this day, every day about this time on the Grueling Truth Sports Network. You can follow me at Grueling Truth on Twitter. And you can hear our podcast wherever you find podcasts, including iHeartRadio, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, Stitcher. So for now, I'm Mike Goodpaster. You've been listening to The Grueling Truth, where the legends speak.